Hi, this is Coach Jorge. In this video, we're going to review how you can utilize tools like Power Meter and GPAs and other in order to enhance your training. So when we talk about power or pace-based training, we're not necessarily talking about a particular tool. It's more of a way of thinking. It's an approach in which we think in terms of how much work we do and how fast we can do that particular work. So work specifically is like any time that we're doing a task, it will take us a certain amount of work to complete that task. This can be measured in different ways. And given a constant weight, every time that we do a particular task is going to take us roughly the same amount of work. Power and pace are expressions of work rate. That is how fast or not we're doing a particular work or task. So as an example, if I was get to go running for a mile, it will take me a certain amount of work to complete that mile. But if I was to complete that mile at a faster pace, that will mean that I'm doing that work at a faster work rate. So work is how much I'm running, work rate is how fast I'm completing that task. Usually when we are talking about training, most athletes will describe that they're training a certain amount of hours, certain amount of miles, etc. The problem with this is that every time that we only talk about this, we're only talking about work. And it's not telling us how fast or not, or in other terms, the work rate, we're doing that particular set of training. So two athletes may be training different hours, but actually both may be achieving the certain amount of load in terms of their training. So how's that possible? Well, it's all about training load. And training load is the duration, which is the work, the intensity, the work rate, how fast you're doing that work, and frequency, how much training you're doing. So if every time that we train, we're trying to achieve a progressive load, which is doing enough in order for our body to adapt, but not doing too much that our body can't recover. And once we do that, we get fitter, but also we are accumulating fatigue. So the difference between these two is what's going to lead us to an improvement in performance. So that's how work and work rate are very important, and both need to be considered when we're talking about training, not only how many miles or hours you're training. So how do we define intensity or that work rate? Well, most people are going to be using work because it's easy to quantify. You can say how many hours or miles you completed. Intensity or work rate is slightly trickier because this can be defined in many ways. To keep things simple at E3, we define it as intensity that is derived from doing field testing. And then we estimate your 1 hour best effort for all three sports, swimming, cycling, and running. So this actual hour or best effort relates to what we refer as threshold. In a nutshell, we determine your best 1 hour effort from the field testing, and from there it's easy to determine different training zones, what's easy, what's hard, etc. We have different presentations before. We advise you to see some of those that are going to be linked at the bottom of this video so you can get the full picture. But once we know what is or how we're defining work rate or intensity, then it's easy to speak the same language, because we can say we rode 50 miles at a particular intensity, we run 30 minutes at another intensity, and we are speaking the same language. Now, what about heart rate? Heart rate is another way to give us an idea of the work rate that we're doing. However, heart rate is not the best measure for stress because other variables like heat, dehydration, sleep, caffeine, excitement, etc. can alter it. So heart rate is more of a physiological response to the work and work rate that we're doing, while pace or power are more a direct response, or is a stimulus what's occurring on our muscles that are doing the actual work. So every time that we utilize this tool, is giving us a more objective way of really telling us how much work and at what work rate we're doing the particular session. Heart rate can give us a bunch of good information, but again, it can be a little bit skew if we only take that into consideration. For instance, if we look at this graph, on the green line it's power and the pinkish line is heart rate. These athletes, these 4 sets at the same power, and they remain pretty fairly stable, but the heart rate started low and then ended up higher. So if that particular athlete would have trained only by heart rate, then it would have undertrain at the beginning and then overtrain at the end, or vice versa. So this doesn't mean that we should ditch our heart rate. It just means that we need to use it understanding its limitations, because it can directly tell us how other physiological responses are affecting the work and the work rate that we're currently doing. So if we train on a day that we're tired, our heart rate might be slightly higher. And even though we're doing the same work and work rate that usually we can do at a given heart rate, because that day we're tired is going to be higher, and that can give us an idea as like, well, if a couple of days go by and we're noticing this trend, then it might be a good idea to back off a little bit. So the combination of power and pace and heart rate can give us a lot of great training insights to make better training decisions. So what are the advantages of training with power and pace in addition to heart rate? Well, we can objectively measure intensity, what's the work rate with these tools. We're always talking the same language because we can say how much work and how much work rate we did. We can learn how much this work and work rate affects our fitness and adjust your training. You know, if you do a long ride, how long it takes you to recover from that, a short but intense ride or run, etc. It also allows to compare fitness among athletes using things like the power to weight ratio, which we're going to talk a little bit more about it. So if you really want to buy into this idea of training with power and pace, you need to understand a few things. First, in order to use your tools effectively, you need to determine training zones via thresholds, because then we can determine what is the actual work rate that you're going to be doing. And to do this, you can do various tests for all sports, swimming, biking, and running. And all these tests are going to be always over 3 minutes and under 30 minutes. Again, if you want to learn more about it, check our critical power video, explain the reasons why. But you do this test and you use the results, and then we can estimate your best 1 hour efforts that we call them either critical power for cycling, critical velocity for running, or critical swim speed for swimming. And once we have defined those intensities, then again we can define work rate more precisely. We can understand the same language, because we can say, well, out of our critical power, now we're going to train at a particular percentage of that. We can use critical velocity, and then we can say we can train at a particular pace of that, and the same with swimming. So we, for our athletes, do this via our season planner in terms of the different testing that we do for all the sports, and each sport is going to have its own spreadsheet in which you do the test. In here you can see the different durations for these tests. In this particular case is running. This is going to determine the critical velocity or threshold, and from there we can determine our training paces. The other cool thing is that it'll help us also predict, if you're properly trained, what would be the pace that you should be able to sustain for longer distances. It allows us to predict also your potential for particular distances in triathlon, not only running in this particular case. It helps us break down what intensities you could target when you're doing things like a track workout, and also allow us to set up goals, track trends, etc. So it gives you a lot of very important information that is going to be very useful for you as an athlete, and obviously for the coach to make adjustments for your training. Now, keep in mind that these training zones are man-made. And that is that your body doesn't really know when you're like in full zone 1 or in full zone 2. I mean, you know how it feels, but it's not that because you are doing a training session and also you're a little bit on zone 1 and on zone 2, you're completely canceling the adaptations that you're trying to maximize, because all zones interlayer with each other, and hence when you're doing a particular training session at one intensity, that's going to maximize certain adaptations, but at the same time it's going to induce some other adaptations occurring on other zones at a lesser degree. So it's a continuum, and we're always adapting. It's just how much we're spending on that particular work and work rate. It just helps us make the training more efficiently. So to make things more precise for you, there's some terms that you need to remember when we're talking about power and pace, so that way when you're looking at your power file or a GPS file, or you're talking to your coach, you can better understand the language. So Always when we're talking about thresholds, we're referring to critical power for cycling, critical velocity for running, critical swim speed for swimming. From there, we're always going to define your training zones. And in terms of power or pace, we also talk about things like what's your average pace or your average power for a session. So what was the actual work work rate you did in that session? What was your normalized power, or what is called a normalized graded pace, which is what it's a equation derived from all the data that your devices are gathering, and it estimates what's the metabolic cost of the work that you're doing. What is important is that by having this information, it will tell you that when you did a ride and you spend it 30 minutes going up a hill and 30 minutes down the hill, that's going to give you a particular average pace. But you know that when you were going uphill, you were working that much harder than you were going downhill. So this equation takes that into consideration and tells you what was the real metabolic cost for the session. Another thing, it's the intensity factor, which is the work rate or what intensity you did on a particular session. So if you have an if of 70, it means that you train at 70% of your threshold. Then we have something called the training stress score, or TSS, which is how much work you ended up doing on a session based on your work rate or the intensity. So to make the thing simple, 1 hour at threshold equals 100 points. If you go and ride for 5 hours and you accumulated 300 points, that it means that 5 hour is the equivalent of riding 3 hours as hard as you can. Another term is variability, which is what was the difference between your average power and your normalized power or pace. And this is an important thing to know because the more variable our training sessions or racing is, it's gonna affect your energy systems in different ways, and in triathlon more specifically, eventually it's gonna be costing you on the next leg that you're gonna be competing. For power, how much energy we use, we refer to kilojoules, which is an expression of work. And then for running or swimming, we're usually talking about calories, how much energy was spent. So now that you know all this, now let's put it into practice. The first thing is you always have to calibrate your power meter properly before using it, so then you get accurate data. Each device is going to have its own way. In this case, I'm showing how I do it with my Joule, but Garmin and other devices are going to have its own. So make sure you know how to do that. Next, let's put into practice how to utilize power and pace in order to do some analysis and understand the concepts that you just learned. So in this particular case, this is my training log, and I'm just going to give you an example using one of my workouts. In this case, it's a 6-hour ride, 103 miles, and in this particular window, it gives you kind of a summary of the ride with a lot of information like duration and distance, which would be work, the intensity factor, that would be the work rate, and some other stuff. You can enter obviously here a bunch of information about it, and then you can also click on here on the left. You can go to more summary about your power distribution curve, your heart rate information, your power, etc. I actually like to click the expand button and then go here to do my actual analysis. So here is a lot of information of the ride. And the first things that I go to is look on the right side here. I like to look at the summary information. So you see the duration, distance, the training stress score, or TSS. In this case, it's almost 350 points, which means that this ride, 103 miles at 74%, felt as if I would have done 3.5 back-to-back efforts for 1 hour at my threshold. Okay, so obviously that in reality wouldn't happen, but if you ended up going at a lesser intensity for longer periods of time, then you can actually make it happen. So this is just a good number to know, because then you know how much training load you accumulated for the workout. Other useful information is work. I won't go into details right now, but roughly kilojoules can be assumed that it's 1-to-1 with calories. So this is roughly the energy that we use for the workout. Understanding all these different things can be very powerful, because if we know that for the entire ride I almost utilize 3,800 calories, then I would need to make sure that for the ride, before the ride and during the ride, I'm consuming close to that. That way I'm not going to be risking hitting the wall or bonking or whatever. And for a race, that's even more important, especially for long distance racing, because we're using so much energy, especially when we get to the run, that if we don't fuel enough on the bike, then we're going to be struggling. Normalized power, which is what it felt to our legs compared to the average power. You can see my average power was lower, 168, but because sometimes I was going harder, sometimes I was going easier, which can be seen, for instance, here on the distribution curve. Sometimes I was going uphill, and uphill I was working pretty hard. So when I was going uphill right here, I was working around 240 watts, but then I was going downhill some other times, and I was barely working, 16 watts average, 52 watts normalized. So that's why normalized is a good number to see, because this is how it really felt to your legs. Then we can see other information like your heart rate, your cadence, etc. It also gives you your watts per kilogram. I mentioned this earlier. This is a great way to see how you stack with versus other people, because basically what we do is we convert our weight into kilograms, and then we divide it by the power that we were able to sustain. And this is great information to know, because now it allows us to compare athletes and skills. For instance, usually heavier athletes or males versus females might be able to generate more power, more absolute power, because they tend to have a greater muscle mass. However, once we take weight into consideration, then the difference almost disappears, may turn around, because a seemingly lighter, smaller female may have a higher watts per kilogram, meaning she can generate more power per kilogram greater than the male, and that's why she might be able to go faster. Another important thing to see is your variability. Right here, this is very important, especially for races, because we want to keep this variability, which is the average power and the normalized power, as close to each other as possible. The more variable the ride, if I select my entire ride, it's very variable, 1.14. That means that for some portions I was pedaling a lot, for some portions I was not pedaling enough. And this is just, the result of stopping, riding in a group, all these different things in a race, especially for triathlon. Since you should be riding by yourself without drafting, then you have to be doing all the work. And the more this power goes up and down, especially above your threshold, then you're going to be using limited sources of energy, and then eventually it's going to end up costing you, particularly on the run. We can do the same for other workouts. In here, I'm going to look at a running one. And in this particular case, gives you a lot of information as well. But also, what it gives you is a comparison between your average pace and your normalized graded pace. And as I mentioned, this is how it felt to your legs. So in this particular case, in the first mile, if I select it, you can see it right here that it's mostly downhill. So even though my pace was 7:52, it felt almost like 8:30s for my body, because I was going downhill. On other portions, when I was going uphill, you can see that my average pace was lower, obviously because we're going uphill, almost 8s, but it felt close to 7:30s to my body. So this is a great thing to learn and understand, because it can help you to improve your pacing for races, to avoid going too fast, to running uphills too hard, etc. And then when we add heart rate into all this conversation, then we can compare trends over time, see when every time I'm doing roughly a 30-minute run around 70% of my threshold, that my heart rate should be roughly around 130 beats per minute. Sometimes a little bit higher, sometimes a bit lower. But if on a session is significantly higher, let's say it's around 140 beats per minute, then that day might indicate that other physiological things are affecting my particular work and work rate. Might be because I'm dehydrated, I'm too hot on that particular day, maybe I'm carrying fatigue if it was lower, maybe I'm getting sick, etc. So this is a very neat way to look at different things. So I hope you found this video useful. You can always check us out at our website, e3ts.com, and if you have any questions, please let us know. Thank you.